All right. I think we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to my dining room, or welcome to my dining room if you haven't joined us before. In that case, I'm Lisa. I am the Horticulture Tech and Master Gardener Coordinator with the VCE Stafford office. This is my boss and mentor, Guy Mussey, the horticulture agent with the VCE Stafford office. We are here today to answer your questions about lawn garden pests, anything you might want to know about. And to get the ball rolling, we have a couple of select questions that we've received in the office. So we will go ahead and get started with those. I hope everybody can hear us and see us. If you can't, please type something in the chat box, or if you can, please type something in the chat box. That would be fantastic. Okay, so Guy, one of our office questions. You ready?
I am ready.
I'm putting you on the spot. You ready? Okay. Is spraying the lawn for mosquitoes effective control?
Well, that's actually a really good question. As you know, I have a master's in entomology, and for years, I thought that was a waste of time. When I was in Florida, they used to do a project through the main streets of Hallandale Beach, where they would come in with a fulgur and a pyrethroid insecticide, usually in the evening, and they would fog the streets to kill mosquitoes. And that worked as long as the fog was there. As soon as the mist or whatever settled to the ground, it was ineffective. That was an adulticide. Most of the time when we control mosquitoes, we're dealing with larvicide, the little wigglers in the water. If you have standing water, something like that, there are BT and some other products you can use. But adults are altogether different because they feed on people, not on plants.
Right.
So
we hate them. Everyone hates them.
So my feelings.
Thank you, Alvin.
What's that?
Alvin said he can see and hear us, so I said thank you, Alvin.
Okay, thanks, Alvin. So of course the logical area on this would be that spraying plant material in your yard isn't going to be very effective. And I've held that for years. I've actually contacted Eric Day, the entomology specialist at Tech, to talk to him about it, because I've read some other things that there is some efficacy with spraying your yard with some insecticides, mostly pyrethroids, which don't last real long. And it turns out that mosquitoes, when they come into your yard, they rest. They fly and they have to light on something. Usually it's shrubbery, low-lying shrubbery.
You mean they light on something other than my ankles?
Yes, they do.
That's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah, if I was a mosquito, I don't know if I'd want to do that. But they do rest on foliage, mostly on shrubbery, low-lying, low branches of trees and all. And so if there's an insecticide on it, they get it on them. It doesn't kill them instantly, but it will kill them ultimately, and it will reduce numbers to a point. The problem with that is it's only temporary.
Okay.
You have mosquitoes coming in, and it's not just foliage. The actual question I got was the lawn. Is it effective to spray the lawn? And that's even less effective than shrubbery. So if you have a real problem with mosquitoes and you want to use an insecticide that's labeled for that, you can spray your shrubbery. It will reduce them for a period of time. But remember, you got them coming in from your neighbors, and they're not always lighting on the foliage. They may rest somewhere else as well. I just don't think it's worth the effort to go ahead and spray.
Well, and Judy has a question. She wants to know if what they use in spraying the lawn or the foliage also harms beneficial insects.
Well, any insecticide will. Obviously, timing is critical. We always tell people if you're good, you have to spray your roses or something, or your flowering plants, to don't direct it towards the flowers because of the pollinators like the bees, and do it, when the sun goes down so the bees aren't flying around it. It still is going to, yes, any insecticide you put in the environment will affect beneficials. That's certainly true.
Okay. All right. Well, speaking of pollinators, Hot topic right now. Are the Asian giant murder hornets in Virginia?
That's a hogweed question, giant hogweed questions. A few years ago, when giant hogweed was the rage and you heard it on the media and it was everywhere, I got numerous calls every week, just about every day, about sightings of giant hogweed, and it is a pretty bad plant. I'll get to the hornets in a minute, but I want to illustrate how the media can really hype this stuff up. Out of all the sightings and all the investigations I did, and I had to go out and investigate every one because it was a dangerous plant. It still is a dangerous plant. I had not found one in the Spotsylvania, Stafford area. Yes, I know there was a guy that supposedly got into it, a worker, a landscaper here in Fredericksburg, but that was never confirmed. I investigated the site numerous occasions with the USDA and others. We never found the giant hogweed there. So when we go to this, I've gotten several questions in the last few weeks about these murder hornets from Japan or China or Asia. And they cited, one lady even said that she was absolutely sure she knew what it was. She cited it and it was, she took pictures, which weren't really good pictures. I again contacted Eric Day at the entomology department, and he assured me they weren't here in Virginia. I assumed they were probably European hornets, which is a large wasp-like hornet.
You mean that have been reported to us? You're assuming those are European?
Yes,
yeah. That's what
they're seeing because they're out. They're not as big as the Asian giant murder hornets, if you will. And then if you investigate a little bit, there was only one sighting of them, nest of them, if you will, in I think it was in British Columbia.
State.
Well, Washington State, yeah. They came into British Columbia. And it turns out that they don't disperse very easily. They think it was a queen that came in and started a nest, not a whole nest, because they do create very large nests. But she started a colony, and they don't fly far from their nest, usually about 700 yards. So they're not going to move fast. They don't move on their own. If they're going to move around the country, it'll probably be carried with something else that humans are moving. So that was the only sighting, and they should be fairly easy to control since they don't fly very far. Now, if you read about it, there was some questions about, well, what about in Asia? What do they do? Well, in Asia, they're considered beneficials. Yes, they attack beehives and bees, but they attack a lot of other insects as well. And they live right along with them there in Asia and aren't concerned about them at all. But the key is the media hype that you get. When you start reading about it in the news, I start getting the calls. So, if you think you have it, please give me a call. Take a picture if you can.
Or just run.
Yeah.
That would be my response. If it's that big and it's got a stinger, I'm running. I'm not taking pictures. Call me crazy.
But
that's just me.
None have been sighted in Virginia, and I doubt whether we will in the near future. So take it with a grain of salt.
Okay. Well, moving on from invasive insects, how about some invasive plant questions? You ready for that? Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I have some questions about getting rid of some invasive plants and trees on my property, namely tree of heaven and honeysuckle. Do you just want to tell us about the best way to do that? Or
go ahead.
Do you want me to read the whole question? Okay. Both are on the property line between my neighbor and I, and have spread over into an unused part of my garden. I've spent about 2 weeks digging up everything that was in the garden, so the garden is clear for the time being. My long-term solution is to plant something in that part of the garden and at least keep it cultivated and in check. I've cut down the tree of heaven trees, and my next step was to spray the stumps with some kind of herbicide, like Roundup. Should just the top of the stump be sprayed, or should I cut a fresh surface on the stump and then spray them? The honeysuckle may be another problem. As I mentioned, I dug up all that has spread in the garden, but a fence along the property line is covered with it. Would herbicide be a solution?
Well,
take it away.
probably the only solution. I answered this question for this guy in the email, and I told him he actually, by cutting them down, he actually made the problem worse. Tree of Heaven is not only spread by the voluminous seeds that it produces, but also by stolons and rhizomes, and it runs along the ground. I call it it's a volunteer. It walks essentially from its site and can fill in an area very quickly from the roots. So when you cut a tree down, a Tree of Heaven down, you're going to get lots of sprouts coming all over the place. You're going to create a real a jungle of Tree of Heaven by doing that. And I told him, I said, you kind of missed the boat on that one. Typically, if you have Tree of Heaven and you want a large tree and you want to get rid of it, there's what we call the slash and pour method, where you would take an axe and slash into the bark, through the cambium, into the xylem area, through the phloem and all, and then you would pour a particular herbicide like Garlon that's labeled for it. It will be taken by the plant into the roots, and it will destroy the roots and everything. And then the tree dies. Once the tree dies, then you can cut it down, and that way you know it's not going to spread. So this guy already cut it down. So there's another method where they you can treat the stump. However, for that to be effective, you've got to pour an herbicide on that within 5 minutes after you cut it, because the herbicide will not be absorbed by the stump and will not get to the roots. So he kind of made a mess for himself at that point. Once these sprouts start to come up, I mean, I've known people that have them growing along their yards, and they mow their yards, and there's sprouts of Tree of Heaven everywhere. They just mow right over them, but they keep coming. You know, they keep them down, but they keep the sprouts keep coming. It's not going to kill the tree. So what he can do is allow them to grow up a little bit, and then use a product like Roundup, and it's still legal, and it's there's been a lot of research on it. It's still safe to use if you use it according to label. But Roundup, what makes it so good is it's systemic. It is translocated to the roots. Now, understand something. If you had a large tree and you cut that down, it's got an extensive root system. So allowing the foliage to come up, and of course, Roundup is only absorbed through foliage, not through the ground, not through the roots. It's deactivated, it's broken down, and it's no longer effective. So you have to get it on leaves, growing leaves, and something that's growing. So this time of year would be a good time on using it. But you would have to let it get up a few feet or so. If there's enough leaves, spray it. That will be translocated, kill roots, kill those stems, and then it might come up again several times. So you might have to do it several times if you've got a pretty extensive root system. And of course, that would be the same thing with the honeysuckle. Spray it with a systemic like glyphosate or Roundup. But you might have to do it if it's a large shrub. If it were a bunch of honeysuckle growing on a fence, I would cut it all back. I'd take it off there so I don't have to use so much, spread out so far, and then let it sprout again. And it's got to be actively growing. And so I know I've had questions before about glyphosate and using Roundup, like in the fall or the winter. Keep in mind, these herbicides are growth regulators. They actually inhibit certain cycles, biological cycles within the plant. So the plant has to be actively growing for them to work. That means when it gets into fall and plants are slowing down processes, it's not going to work near as fast. In the spring, that's probably the best time to use it. So you can use it in the fall, but it's just going to take a little longer. I had some poison ivy at the first house that I rented when I moved here. In the backyard, large vines I cut that were going up the tree. I let it come up, and it was September, October. I did spray, and it took about 2-3 weeks for them even to turn yellow, but they did, and it ultimately did kill them. So understand that. I know I talked about this, I think a year or so ago at one of our meetings at a Q&A session about, can you use Roundup in the winter? What do you think? Can you use it in the winter? Does it work at all?
I would think it would depend on what you were using it on.
Absolutely. Anything dormant, it's not going to do anything.
I get a Scooby snack, huh? Yay! Alvin has a question, I guess going back to the Tree of Heaven. He wants to know if you can drill a hole in the stump and then pour the herbicide into the hole?
An old stump, I mean, you can do that. Whether it's going to be effective or not is a big question. Again, the stump, for herbicides to work, they need to be taken into the system. And just pouring something into the stump itself is not going to be translocated into the roots once the stump, dries out. Okay, it's just not going to be that effective.
So it's going to be very timing dependent.
Yeah, there are products you can use to help deteriorate or decay, if you will, or break down stumps, stump removal things, but that's not going to get into the roots. Okay, the roots are well out there beyond the drip line of the tree, and anything you use to destroy that stump isn't going to affect those roots. So you're still going to get tree of heaven sprouting throughout your yard or throughout the area where the tree is growing.
Thank you. All right, next question. This one's about raspberries. Earlier in the spring, I temporarily moved some raspberry plants to another part of my yard to clear out weeds and honeysuckle that were taking them over. Now that area has been cleared out, the raspberries are starting to bloom. I would like to move them back to their original location, but considering they are in bloom, would it be wise to wait to move them?
Oh, would it be wise? That's the key.
That's always the key, right?
Well, as any of you have ever taken my class, when I talk about planting times and all, obviously bloom time is not the best time to move plants. The energy is going into the blooms and the fruit and not into root production. So that typically is not a good time to transplant. However, every situation can be a little bit different. And in this case, the guy already dug them out earlier in the spring. So the roots were already severed. So evidently he has them healed in somewhere, probably in mulch or somewhere in the yard. So think about it. It's just common sense that if they're already dug up, the roots were already severed for transplants, then absolutely put them in the ground. So the question comes in is, when you say planting, what do you mean by planting? Do you really mean transplanting, digging it up and then moving it? Bad time when things are in bloom. But if it's already dug up and you're just planting it in the ground, in other words, digging a hole, yeah. So that's what I told him. I said, put them in as soon as you can. Now, if you're going to do any transplanting, and of course, bloom time is not a good time. Summer is probably one of the worst times because of the heat and you're severing roots. But keep in mind, what do I always say? The plants don't read the literature. I'm telling you what is the best time to do it, the optimum time, but it doesn't mean the plants can't live. But the attrition goes down when you're doing it at the wrong time. It becomes stressful. So if you have to transplant this time of year, and you really need to do that, then I would suggest you wait till like a day like today, which is cloudy, a little cooler, and you're not going to have that sun. Well, cold.
It's cold out.
That would be better to do it on a cloudy day than it would be in the full sun, where those root hairs that you have saved, that you dug up with the plant, it only takes a matter of minutes for them to dry out in the sun. So you dig something out, you lay it out in the yard for a few, half hour or whatever, while you're digging the hole or however long, you're reducing its chances of survival tremendously. So do it on a cloudy day, have the hole dug already, then transplant it into the hole if it's not an optimal time. So what is the optimal time to plant? What do you think?
I'm going to go with fall, late fall.
You think so?
I think. I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. If you're going to plant.
I'm just the tech. I don't have the master's degree.
You got, yeah.
I'm going to get in trouble.
She is. She has learned so much so fast. She should have a master's in this. But indeed, fall is the best time. And why is that? Well, the plant's going dormant, so it's not going to be transpiring a lot, not needing a lot of water to live, so you don't have the heat of the day and everything. And also, the roots will continue to grow even when the top of the plant goes dormant, down to about 55 degrees. That's not a switch. It doesn't shut off at 55. There's a gradation there where it slows down till it gets below about 55, and then growth stops. So if you're in September, October, even November around here in Virginia, it could, you might get down to 30 degrees with the ambient air temperature, and the ground is still at 65, 70 degrees. Yeah, transplant them, let them get healed in, let the roots get established for next spring so it can come out nice and strong in the spring.
Fantastical. All right, so speaking of cooler weather, when does red thread typically appear in lawns?
What's red thread? What are you talking about, red threads? That's something that you sow with, isn't it?
Well, it's something I sow with. We all know what my lawn looks like. I don't have any grass, so I don't have to worry about red thread.
It's a fungal disease that does attack, and I've gotten several questions recently on it, where it actually produces these red threads. These are the mycelium that you see of the fungus that's growing on the plant. And it can reduce the plant's vigor. Typically speaking, well, they like cooler weather. So it's spring and fall is when you're going to see it from 40 to 70 degree day temperature. So you see it out there now if it's out there. It likes cool season grasses like bluegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, and tall fescue. And you will see the grass starting to brown up a little bit. It generally doesn't attack the crowns of the plant or the roots. So this is one of those diseases that if you leave it alone, it will come back. Not the disease, I mean the grass will come back when the conditions are better. It does like low fertility grass, so if you keep your, do your normal nitrogen fertilization in the fall, and if you do have a bad infestation of red thread, you can do like a half a pound in the spring of nitrogen, and the plant will be able to withstand that. It overwinters as sclerotia. Sclerotia is sort of sclerotized mycelium. So it will overwinter in the grass that way. And then when the temperatures are right, it comes alive. And there are fungicides you can use as well if you really have a bad infestation. But my recommendation is, enjoy the pink color and just mow over it. And it should go away when the grass perks up.
Okay. So the last question we have from Adventures at the Office is, my tomato leaves are yellowed and curling. What could be the problem?
Yeah, I'm surprised they have tomato leaves curling already.
But hey.
Yeah, with this cool weather, my goodness. Well, when I see contorted growth on especially on something, like tomatoes, a succulent plant like that, where it's not woody, I typically think of either herbicide damage or aphids. Aphids feed, but with a piercing, sucking mouth part. They pierce into the plant stem or the plant leaf and suck the sap out. And they exude a PGR, plant growth regulator, when they're doing that, which causes the plant, at least the new growth, to contort and grow, curl up and all. And you'll see this quite often in plants like that, in flowers and what have you, with aphids. What I usually do if somebody, I'll have them bring a sample in, which they can't now, the office is closed, but nonetheless, if there aren't any signs of aphids, for instance, even if there's no live aphids, you'll see cast skins and different indications that there are aphids on it if they are there. If they're not, then it's pretty much got to be herbicide damage. I had a guy a few years ago bring in some plants that, he said his tomato plants were all curled and wanted to know what the problem was. And I said, well, bring them in. Well, he brought in a whole plant. He had a big truck patch out in the country, and he brought in a whole plant, and it was just contorted. And I told him, I says, it's got to be herbicides. I don't see anything else it could do. And he insisted it wasn't. He says, I don't use herbicides. I'm completely organic. I use nothing like that. And I says, well, that's what it looks like. And he got a little irate about it. And I says, I'll tell you what, we'll send it into the lab and let them decide, okay? So we did send it into the plant diagnostic lab at Tech. And sure enough, within a week or week and a half, comes back, and they usually have this terminology. Their jargon is insufficient sample if they didn't find anything. What that means is there was no causal organisms on the specimen or the sample that we sent in. So, and then further on in the report, they surmise and say, this looks like herbicide damage. They don't test for herbicides at the lab. So they just says, look, it's probably herbicide damage. Well, when I took it back to the guy and I read it to him and sent it to him, and he again insisted it couldn't be herbicides. So then, as I usually do, you have to be a detective. You start pulling teeth and asking questions. And so I asked him, I said, well, how about, do you have any lawn care people coming in? Do you spray anything? I don't spray anything. I don't have lawn care. I said, how about your neighbors? I live out in the country in the middle of my 10 acres, and there's nothing could have been oversprayed on it. There's just no way herbicides could have gotten on these tomatoes. So after I talking for a bit, all of a sudden the light bulb went off, and I asked him, I says, well, do you fertilize it? I don't use synthetic fertilizers. I says, okay, what do you use? I use horse manure. Aha, horse manure. Well, it turns out, there's a class I teach with pesticide recertification for commercial people called the fate of environmental fate of pesticides, or the fate of pesticides in the environment. What really happens? What's the science? Do they break down quickly? What goes on? And most pesticides break down within days, weeks, or months. They don't last for years anymore. The EPA has been very diligent in banning long-lived pesticides like DDT. That's the big reason it was banned back in the 70s. And then a lot of insecticides in that chlorinated hydrocarbon family, which is what DDT is, like dieldrin and aldrin, were banned as well because they were long-lived. They lasted years. Then they started into the organophosphates like Dursban, diazinon a few years ago, lasted a little longer than they wanted them to. They were banned. So there aren't many, if any, pesticides anymore that last a long time, except there is one family of pesticides, the carboxylpyridines, which is an herbicide. Turns out horse people spray that in their pastures, okay, to get rid of bull thistle and a lot of the plants that horses will not eat and do not like and are a weed in their pastures. They will spray that, and the horses will get on their forage and on the grasses that they're eating, and they will eat this pesticide. It does not hurt the horse at all. It goes right through its gut. Does not break down. It takes months to break down, maybe a year, depending on how it's composted, the manure is composted. But it maintains its efficacy through the animal, doesn't hurt the animal, into the manure, and into this guy's tomato garden.
That's a heck of a pesticide.
So I told him, I says, you need to talk to the guy that you got, the farmer that you got the horse manure from, and ask him if he sprayed any of this in the past year or so in his pastures, because that's probably what was dealing with it. So you never can be too sure about this stuff, and no matter how it seems like, how diligent you are, sometimes it just doesn't work, and these things are everywhere.
All right. Well, keeping with our tomatoes, Judy wants to know, what can you do about early tomato blight?
Yeah, that's a big one. There are recommendations. It's pretty much, if it's too bad, if you only have a few plants and you've got it in your garden, you've got to get rid of it, and don't compost those plants. Okay, get rid of them. Tie them up, put them in a bag, and get rid of the plants. Clean up any leaves or any leaf litter or anything from the plant that has fallen, because it's a source of inoculum. But there are fungicides that you could use for early blight. I don't have the recommendation book manual in front of me, the PMG, but we can certainly look into that and find out what. And there's timing is always critical with these things, and the type of fungicide you're going to use. But you're pretty much going to have to spray for something like that.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? We're out of all the good stuff we got at the office.
I got a few other things.
You got a few other things?
Yeah.
All right.
I read.
You think we should just let them talk?
Yeah.
I mean, that seems
good. Yeah,
dangerous.
I'm good at that,
That's dangerous. All right. I'll give you 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, a few years ago, I'm sure everyone that was around here, maybe it's 3 years. I lose track of time. We had the periodical cicadas, right? They were devastating in our area. I remember walking outside in the afternoon, and I could not talk to my wife right next to me because of the noise. They were up in the trees. When you drove out in the country, you saw these big oak trees and maples and everything with what we call flagging, dead limbs or dead branches with the leaves, foliage still on them from that year, just hanging there like flags. And they were everywhere. Well, it turns out there are two types of or species of periodical cicadas. There's the 13-year periodical cicadas and the 17-year. Well, a few years ago we had the 13-year, so we figured, okay, we're good for 13 years. Well, no, the 17 years cicadas will be out this year, not in our area. Okay, there are broods, what they call broods. Where they will infect certain areas of population, and then when they're done, and sometimes these brood areas overlap, so you may get them more than 1 year. But right now, I don't know if it's brood 9. I think it's 9 or 10.
I think it's 9.
Yeah, it's going to come out in the southwestern Virginia, fairly large area where they're going to be there. We may get some here, but I don't think we're going to have a problem this year. Next year, but I read an article from Tech.
Next year, however.
Yeah. They had a map of Virginia, and they had the areas lined out of what years they are. And guess where the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, Stafford area is 2021. We're due for the 17-year cicadas. So just giving you that little bit of heads up. If they were even close to being as bad as the 13-year were a few years ago, it's going to be a mess out there. Now,
it's going to be crazy.
Do they hurt our trees? Not the mature trees. They won't kill them. The adults don't feed, but very little. Most of the feeding is done on the roots over 17 years or 13 years, and then they emerge as an adult. And their main goal is to mate. Okay. So the feeding isn't what does the damage to plants is the oviposition of the female. She has a saw-like ovipositor. She will cut into the stem, and usually there are 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch stems, not bigger than that. And she will create a long slice in it, lay her eggs. She can lay from 1 to 40 eggs in there. And then the stem eventually dies. The eggs will hatch out within a few weeks, and then they drop to the ground, burrow in, and they start the process over again. So if you have a mature oak tree or maple or sugarberry or whatever in your yard, it will get some damage, but it probably won't hurt it to any extent. If you have young trees that you just planted, fruit trees, yes, it can do some damage on those because most of the branches are the size that they need to lay their position. Yeah. And there are things you can do for it. If it's a small enough tree, you can cover it. You just need to make sure you tie it really close at the base of the tree so they can't crawl up underneath the net. But you can put netting over these trees to keep them off if there are small trees in your yard that you don't want to attack. But they're coming. They're coming.
They're coming. Oh, boy. Okay. Diana wants to know if we have any pointers on raising cauliflower. It's her first year growing them. Almost 95% of the seeds germinated, and she just planted 95 cauliflower seedlings. You've been busy.
Wow.
Busy.
I'll tell you what, get a hold of me when they're ready to harvest. I love cauliflower. I don't have any tips. I mean, like any other vegetable plant, make sure you get them in the ground properly. I can't.
Are there any particular pests or anything that you can think of to look out for? I'm kind of going through, my experiences, and I can't think of anything that would be helpful.
Not off the top of my head. I'd have to look that one up. My philosophy is plant enough for everything else to eat, so you still have some.
Yeah, you got to have the sacrificial area for the critters. Yeah, that helps. It helps. But yeah, I've grown cauliflower many, many, many times. I've never had any problems with it. I actually find it pretty easy, pretty hardy. And even when other things are struggling, it's doing okay. But yeah, if you've got 95 of them, definitely let us know when they're ready. We'll help you eat them anyway.
Good job, Diana.
Yeah, solid work. Anybody else got any questions? Do you want?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do have some others, and I don't know if you
show
can
and tell
see
that may or may not
see these.
show well.
We've had an individual email us about some damage to plants. And I'm going to put this up to the and see if you can see this.
I'm not sure
This is
how it'll come across.
A red Japanese maple, and you can see the damage underneath. Okay, on some of those leaves. All right, this happened this spring. We just got those. We also have some damage to hosta.
So Japanese maple and her hosta plants.
Okay, I'm trying to see if you can see. You can see the marginal necrosis around that. Okay, pretty extensive. But she said several of the plants that have that I'm not going to show you all of them. So what? Oh, here's a nice one on the maple.
Yeah,
Japanese red maple. Look at that. You can see the good leaves, and you can see the leaves that are affected. Okay. So what's the problem? Is that a disease? Is that an insect? Typically, when I see that, like for instance, the marginal necrosis on the hosta, that typically indicates some abiotic problem or damage, not necessarily disease. Although diseases can produce that, but usually there's a gradation where you get a chlorosis. You'll get sort of a marginal ring between the dead area and the green, which is the invasion site. You don't see any of that on these plants. These go from dead to living, okay? So it's usually abiotic. Now, what's happened recently in our environment that might cause that? That's what you need to go back and think about, okay? We've had some cold weather. Matter of fact, there was frost warnings. We had a frost watch, I think, a week ago.
We did. After some really balmy, delightful, like perfect Lisa weather, we had frost warnings.
And in Spotsy, we didn't get any frost because my bananas plants are growing. My bromeliads are out there in the backyard. And if we had even a smell of frost, they would have shown it. And I had no indication at all. I did not cover them. I just figured, well, let it nature fall where it may. So we didn't have the frost in Spotsy. Doesn't mean it couldn't have been sporadic. Low-lying areas can get frost where they're higher up. They wouldn't because frost, of course, the cold air is heavier and it moves down. So these could be in areas that were smaller. I think it's cold damage. There is a little bit difference between frost damage and cold damage. Cold damage actually doesn't immediately destroy the cells. Frost damage does. That's where ice is formed within the cell and the cell bursts, and then you get this blackening. Essentially, it turns black, and then necrotic and brown dries up right away. Some of these are distorted a little bit. The coloring is off. I think that is sort of a cold type of desiccation or cold damage from the cold weather, even though it may or may not had frost, but it was really close to it. So these are new leaves as well. They're not hardened off yet. I have seen this happen in our area many times over the years. I remember a few years ago, our cherry trees were blooming. We had a beautiful, warm, early spring. Everything was blooming nice. The ornamental cherries were out, gorgeous. And then we had a hard frost, and that was in late April. Typically, the frost date here in Fredericksburg is generally about April 15th. That's not a definite, that's an average. You have to understand. Yeah, that was certainly wrong this year.
Definitely wrong this year.
We were into May when this frost hit. And what they do is they just look at the average frost date over 10, 20 years, and they come up with that date. But as I say, nature, she don't care what your average is. It's going to happen when it happens. And so we had a very late frost this year, and cold, if not frost, then certainly cold damage. And so these are new leaves coming out. I would guess that one. So what I was saying, though, is a number of years ago, the things were full blown. The leaves were starting to, actually the buds broke and the leaves were starting to form. And then we had a hard frost. And it was, a month or two later, and you go out and the new leaves are out, smaller, less of them. and then there were these black globules everywhere. People didn't know what they were. Well, you forget, 2 months ago we had a hard frost, and that's still the tissue that was damaged, that was dry now. It was still on the plant. And so with that in mind, I didn't take this into the lab and examine it, but
Because
knowing but knowing the conditions of what we've had and looking at the symptoms, I would guess it's probably frost.
Okay. So while everybody's watching and we're talking about this, I'm actually the one that received these pictures and looked at them. And before I made a, educated guess, since we can't diagnose through the lab, about what they were, I wanted to run it by a guy. And so with all of these witnesses, so I was right.
Well,
I was right that it was cold damage.
if that's what you said.
That's exactly what I said when I emailed you.
Well,
I just want to make sure that in front of witnesses that we agree that I was right.
The caveat to that is, if I'm right.
If you're right, yeah. Well, I should say we're in agreement.
Yes.
We're in agreement. Okay. Glad we got that out of the way.
What I gotta put up with.
I'm not competitive or anything.
No.
Like that. We're not competitive. I just like. I was right. Okay. Alvin wants to know if Virginia Tech is taking soil samples and sending out results. They are. My understanding is that they are still prioritizing commercial growers. So there may be a longer turnaround on that. We're able to mail out the kits if people need them. Or, if you have some, you say your neighbor needs them. If you have some, you can give them to your neighbor, practicing all, CDC guidelines. But we can certainly, we have ways to get you the kits. And it's my understanding that they're still prioritizing commercial growers. Is that your understanding?
They are, but they are doing
residential as well. It's just the turnaround may be a little longer than you're used to, but,
a couple weeks.
A couple weeks, 3 weeks instead of, like the week to 10 days.
The problem is getting the soil test kits because our building is closed.
Because our building is closed. We have arranged, so far we've done contactless pickup for some of our master gardeners. And then for residents of the community, we have mail tests out.
Yeah,
so
we'll mail them out if
can,
they want. And if they do want to come by and pick them up and let us know, I can put them in a baggie and leave them out by the front door. And they can pick them up. We've done that as well.
Yeah, so we have workarounds. You can email or call one of us, and we'll be able. We'll be able to
soil testing is still going on. So
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and it's important this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Anybody? Hit them with your best shot. Well, I guess nobody's got any more questions today.
Let me just say one more thing. And I know many of you are master gardeners. Wondering if we're going to have classes this year, when we will start our programming. We really don't know. It's still up in the air. Rouser Building will probably be one of the last buildings open because of the senior center. But I don't know that for sure. They have a limited opening of the government center this past week.
Yeah.
But there's certain things you got to wear a mask, and they take your temperature and all that before you go in. So things are starting to open up a little bit. I'm hoping that they will open up, within the next month or so.
Safely.
By September, I'm an eternal optimist, not. But
Grumpy cat.
I'm planning on doing a master gardener class. If they open it up, we may have to do, spacing and have a limited number at them, but I really don't want to do virtual classes. I know the state is looking into virtual classes. I feel you really need that personal touch personally, and I don't plan on doing virtual classes at this point. So we'll see what happens, but we can't open until the state says and Virginia Tech says open up, and hope then we will start in with our programs.
Which is why we're hanging out in my dining room.
Yes.
On YouTube. But it is nice to virtually see everyone, virtually talk to at least a few of you. That sort of makes our day because we miss you guys. And if nobody's got any other questions, then I guess we'll sign off unless you have
just
else.
Tell people about this. This will be out.
Yeah, this is public.
My editor here is going to put it out as a link so that you can review it if anybody wants to review it or look at it.
Yeah, this recording along with your comments and questions will be available even after we finish up today. It'll be on the channel. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope to have some more content for you soon. In the meantime, happy gardening once it warms up just a little bit. Just a little bit. Happy gardening, guys.